Mhm. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Hear Our Voices. Today we have a special guest, as always. We have Alissa, and she will be talking about. Well, you hear what we're talking about. So, it's Alissa. Introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks so much, Khadija. I'm very happy to be here talking to you. My name is Alissa Tyghter-Gerald, and I work with Settlement Housing Fund. And I am very interested in, issues related to housing and affordable housing, and what that looks like for people who are living in affordable housing and kind of, moving and navigating all these systems.
Excellent. So, today we're going to be talking about how to look at your lease and look at the vouchers and how it works with everything and how does it combine and how to navigate the system in that way. So, can you tell us a little bit how leases work? If somebody doesn't know what a lease is, you can try to really break it down to the bare minimum so you can understand how everything works together and how it's gonna work for you if you end up getting a certain voucher from the city.
Sure. So your lease is basically your legal agreement with your landlord related to the apartment. So it's where you'll find your rent, the lease terms, it's from this date to this date. It'll usually be a year or 2 years, all the terms. So the things that you're allowed to do and you're not allowed to do, things related to utilities, if you're allowed to have dishwashers and clothes, clothes washers and dryers, pets, um, and other kind of regular lingo that you'll see in there related to damage of apartments and things like that. So you'll have to read through it for more specifics. They vary a little bit depending on your landlord or management company, but those are kind of the general things. Some things that might be a little confusing. Um, the rent amount, sometimes you might have what's called a preferential rent if you have a voucher. So if the legal rent on a unit is like $2,000, but your voucher is for something around 1,500, they might have a preferential rent for 1,500, meaning that um, you are linked to it and matched at that rent. But if you see the $2,000, that's the legal rent. So there aren't necessarily implications for that because there are new laws in New York City indicating that if you are leased an apartment with a preferential rent, the preferential rent has to stay with you for the amount of time that you stay in the apartment. So meaning if you have an apartment today for $1,500 as a preferential rent, the preference sticks with you until you leave. The next renter, they might be obligated to pay the $2,000, but for you, it can't change. That again is new or ish. That's been around for about 2 years or so, where it used to be if you had a lease today for $1,500, if the lease was for 2 years, that means in 2023, you might be um, held responsible for the $2,000. So that's where things might get a little bit confusing, but um, that's the main gist. You just want to make sure that everything looks right, all the occupants are accurate before you sign it. Sometimes if you have another adult living with you, or you thought they might be living with you but they're not, you should have them removed. You could get all those things squared away. Usually it's a notarized letter or some other proof, but once you sign it, it's mostly a done deal, except if you have to make changes, you'll have to provide again proof and kind of justification for why someone needs to be removed or added.
So, anybody out there? Hopefully that was clear enough for you guys. I think that's when I was younger, I wish I would have got that lesson because I just went out in the world kind of just living and I didn't know anything about leases and things like that. And I think that's good information for people to know before you sign any document, especially something big like a lease, a car, a house. Make sure you read the information, what's on it, because you can sign up for a lot of different things that you don't realize you're signing. It's basically your life away in that moment. It's very important. So, can you give us examples? Like example, if we have city fabs, how would that work with the lease in a
Yes.
quick side?
Yep. So with city thefts, which is the the most common, kind of voucher or housing support out there, you are eligible for, up to a certain amount in rent. The limits just went up, but I'm not 100% versed in them. I'm a little older as far as my direct interaction with the vouchers. But again, if you're eligible for $1,500, then you can find an apartment for $1,500. Within that $1,500, though, there are different rent responsibilities and portions. So city PEPs will pay a portion, your shelter allowance through HRA will pay a portion, and then you may have a share known as the tenant portion. The tenant portion is calculated based on 30% of your income. So whatever your income is, the HRA will calculate 30%, and that's your tenant portion. And then if you get shelter allowance, you're eligible for shelter allowance. That's also usually a pretty fixed number. That will cover a small amount. Usually it's a couple $100s, and then city FEPs will pay the difference. So that's 3 different sources to cover the whole $1,500. The way it's linked to your lease is it's $1,500. You want to make sure that the lease is for the same amount that your city FEPs is allocated for, and that the terms are also the same. The lease will not indicate the different rent proportions and breakdown. So what that means is you're ultimately responsible for the full rent. City FEPs is the way that you're paying the rent. So you hear a lot about income discrimination and so on and so forth. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it's really important to understand that even though city FEPs is covering perhaps the majority of your rent, you're still responsible for it because it falls to your public assistance case to pay out the city FEPs and the shelter allowance. And then if you have a portion, your tenant share, if that's, working income or SSI or whatever the case may be, then you're responsible for paying that every month. So the lease won't really change much. The only thing that you want to make sure is that the numbers match again. But in understanding how city FEPs works, you want to always ask, what is my portion? What is city FEPs paying? And what will my shelter allowance pay? That allows you to then kind of keep track of all of those payments, because you as the leaseholder and tenant are ultimately responsible to ensure that all of those things are paid every month to the landlord. So you could do that by, if you have access HRA, you could log on and see what payments were made on your behalf from, again, your shelter allowance, and then also for city FEPs, see what payments have been going through. And then your tenant portion, you should also be sure to pay your tenant portion and keep proof of your payments, so that if it comes up or if you notice it hasn't been credited to your account, you can easily kind of show that and have that adjusted with your property manager.
That sounds good. As she said before, for city FEPs, you do have to have an HRA case, because they do pay those funds through that. In example, is that the same like NYCHA and Section 8, or is kind of similar?
They're similar and they're different. The similarities are that there's always a max rent that you're eligible for. And then there's always a tenant share that's based on 30% of your income. They're different in the sense that with Section 8, say you're eligible for $1,500 and it's calculated that your tenant share is $300 a month, you're only going to be charged and responsible for the $300 a month. Usually the landlord is not going to hold you responsible for the Section 8 portion of the payment, because that's different and they get those payments. They're in contract with Section 8. Whereas with city FEPs, your landlord is not in contract with city FEPs or HRA, that's the administrator. With NYCHA, it's similar in the sense, if you're in a NYCHA building, that building is already subsidized. So your lease amount is going to reflect your portion, and then you're just paying your portion along the way. And if it changes, you work with NYCHA, but it's kind of you're not dealing with the subsidy portion at all.
Got it. Is there any other subsidies or vouchers that are different? And or if they're saying, could you name out a couple so people can probably look for it? And also, do you have to be in a shelter for all of these subsidies to work? Or coming from a shelter?
Yep. So the other subsidies that you might hear of are FEPS, which is similar to city FEPS, but it's just kind of, there are different designations and there's different levels of funding, but or different types of funding, but it all kind of acts the same. There are different eligibility requirements that I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't want to give the wrong information. And then there's also the emergency housing voucher, which is similar to, it is basically a Section 8 voucher that's that folks might come across. These are administered usually through shelter or home base or some other specialized groups. So I know some child welfare groups are able to demonstrate eligibility, as well as justice groups and home base and kind of housing prevention instability groups are able to demonstrate eligibility on your behalf. So most of these are done through shelter and you must be in shelter, but with the pandemic, there are also some vouchers and subsidies that have exceptions that you need to be at risk of losing your housing and therefore you could be eligible. So these things are kind of constantly changing. So I would encourage everyone, if you're curious, to do a Google search. The documents are usually pretty easy to find. You should look for documents that are administered or issued rather by HRA, and they should come up pretty high on the Google search. If you put like city FEPS eligibility or FEPS, FHEPS eligibility, or EHV, emergency housing voucher eligibility, NYC, that should come up pretty easily for you.
Something just popped in my head. How does Housing Connect work, like with these leases? And can you explain a little bit about that if you know anything about it?
Yes, quite good question. Housing Connect is the lottery system for all of the newer developments and the re-rentals. So you could apply for Housing Connect, any building in Housing Connect, as long as you meet the income and kind of eligibility requirements, which are outlined on their system per each development. So again, as long as you meet it, you should, and you're interested, you can and should apply. All of those units can be linked with a voucher. There's nothing necessarily specific that you need to do differently to get linked to those, but it kind of works the same way as what I described before, that like you'll have a portion, the city will pay a portion through your shelter allowance and your city FEPS if you have it, or Section 8, or whatever the case may be. What you should be aware of is not all these buildings operate the same. So the subsidy and voucher will always operate the same, give or take. The rules may change a little bit, and you should just kind of try to stay up to date on that. And you could do that by Google, kind of how I described it before. But all of these newer development buildings are a little bit different. So that doesn't mean, I don't think that means that you shouldn't apply. I think if you're kind of in the interview phase or getting closer, that's when you should ask a little bit more, you should ask more questions about what will this actually look like once I live here? What does recertification look like? What happens if my income changes? How will my portion? This is also for non-lottery buildings, but particularly for lottery buildings because they're not regulated the same. So you want to just, again, look at recertification. What am I going to have to report on? How do I report that? What happens if I lose my voucher and I'm in this brand new development? What do I do? So I think that there are a couple more risks there in terms of wanting to understand what your stability and kind of permanency will look like. So those are the questions that come to mind, but all of the vouchers can be linked, but I would exercise a little more caution with understanding what kind of the long term looks like. Usually if you're renting an apartment in like a 30-year-old low rise, walk-up building that's rent regulated, there's risk, right? Because with subsidies or vouchers, there's probably always risk, and I'm sure there's always a feeling of uncertainty, but there's less that can go wrong in those properties. One, because the rent is probably regulated to a lower amount, and two, it's just safer because the buildings are not necessarily bound to other financing issues that play a part in the requirements of the tenant. So I know, like, Khadijah and I know of an example where someone is in one of these properties and she needed to turn over like her, what, I don't even remember the names of the apps, like what's in your Venmo, your Cash App, your this, your that. And like, no one could have ever guessed that would come up. So I think that those are the types of questions to ask if you're going through the lottery building.
Got it. Just in case people don't understand what recertification is, can you explain a little bit about that and how it might work for probably the basic voucher holder?
Yep. So the recertification is basically maintaining your eligibility. So this is something that you definitely want to ask about and understand at the beginning, even when you first get the voucher, even if you're not linked to an apartment, and certainly, again, I would encourage everyone to review it again with someone once you're linked to an apartment. That's, again, your eligibility. So usually it's a once a year thing. So again, if here it is October 20th, if I'm signing a lease today, I'll probably need to start thinking about recertification in August or September of 2022. So depending on what type of voucher you have, it's going to come to you differently. If you have Section 8, they'll send you paperwork directly and you have to submit whatever they request to kind of ensure you remain eligible. And also they'll recalculate your income if it has changed. They'll also recalculate your income if it's changed over the course of the year, but that's just kind of like a point in time when they definitely do it. So if your income has remained steady, then it's just confirming that it's remained steady and none of the portions are changing. Recertification for city PEPs can be a little bit more confusing because it's dealing with HRA, and a lot of us know that that's an imperfect system. So I would keep an eye, if you know that your lease is, again, October 20th to, even if it's a 2-year lease, this is a yearly thing, it's an annual thing. So next August, September, you should be on the lookout for paperwork. If you don't see paperwork coming, I would encourage folks to reach out to HRA and say, hey, I know my recertification, my lease is coming up in October. What's going on with my recertification documents to maintain my eligibility? So you can be a little proactive and see if they could, one, ensure that things will be sent to you, or be sure that they send something to you if it's not already in the works.
God forbid a person doesn't recertify when they're supposed to. How hard is it to get back a voucher, or is it just like completely like doomed? You have to find something else to pay for that portion of the rent.
Yeah, that's another great question. So it's hard to lose a voucher, I'd say, because with Section 8, for an example, they'll reach out to the landlord too. So if they haven't heard from someone even before the recertification is due. So again, sticking with the example of like October 20th, in like September, if I'm a Section 8 recipient, my landlord will also get notification that I need to submit paperwork and please help the tenant do it, right? So they have a couple more eyes, and there are more supports there, and they'll notify you. Even after say I missed it and it's like next week, right? It's like October 27th. They'll send more paperwork to me, like, hey, you missed this, you got to do it. They'll give you, there's a window, I think it's probably like 30 days, but you need to be sure to submit it. Otherwise, once you lose Section 8, then one, it's very hard to get Section 8 again if you ever lost it. And then you're also then subject to eviction because you can't pay your rent. Your rent's not getting paid, right? So you want to be really mindful of those dates, set a calendar reminder, whatever the case may be, is to kind of, again, start thinking about these things a couple of months beforehand. With city PEPs, it's a little bit different because, again, I've heard more times than not that, like, oh, I never got the paperwork, or they sent it late, or whatever the case may be. And that's all true. I know that that's all true. I've seen it happen, and that's how it plays out. So they're a little bit more like, if you go in December because you didn't recertify in October, they do have mechanisms to put it back on your HRA budget, and then it just kind of like picks up again. So it's less, it's a little bit more difficult to lose city PEPs kind of indefinitely, but it does fall off of budgets, and you should and need to get it, rectified as quickly as you can, so that, one, you're not accruing arrears on your account and your rent is being paid, and two, so you don't have, like, it's not more complicated to get it back on your public assistance budget.
So I already know the answer, but I know probably people are asking, does just any old apartment or any old house qualify for these subsidies, or do you have to like get inspections and things like that?
So there are inspections. So there's a Section 8, there's a Section 8 inspection. So if you want to use Section 8 on an apartment, then HPD will come out and inspect it. And same with city PEPs. There is a city PEPs inspection, I'm sorry. They're not the same, but they're similar. So, and if you're moving from shelter, your supports and your workers in the shelter should be pretty well versed in what the inspection looks like and what it takes. So, they're looking for basically serious life safety issues. So like outlets without outlet covers, no window guards, other issues with plumbing, that sort of a thing for city PEPs. With HPD, it's a little bit more, they're looking at a little bit more kind of beyond immediate life safety, but that is part of the process. And the landlord will have access to kind of what the inspector is looking for beforehand, so that they should be able to get everything ready, and the apartment should pass inspection.
Okay, just in case somebody doesn't know, what is HPD?
Oh yeah, sorry. Housing Preservation Department. So that's like the main body that oversees the apartment stock in New York City. So if you have a problem, you call 311. Most of the complaints, they go to HPD, Housing Preservation Department.
Got it. Do you have any last words or anything you want to tell people to kind of help them with this whole process? Because it can be very scary, especially if it's the first time doing something like this. What can you help them out with?
Yeah, I would say just like, really think to ask questions, because I know it could be a rush process and it's overwhelming, and it's like, you want to move, you want to do all these things, and it's exciting at the same time. But, I just have seen so many times people be unsure or surprised by the fact that, like, they didn't know what their portion was that they were responsible for. So, or how city PEPs was being paid. So like, and I know it can be confusing. So, but do your best to ask questions and kind of like demand answers, because ultimately, once you move out of shelter and you're in an apartment with a lease, all too often people say, well, you're on your own. It's your responsibility at this point. So like really understanding the breakdown of portions, understanding that if the city PEPs letter says, you don't have to pay for 3 months. Okay, what does that look like? How do I know that the 3 months were paid and then I start paying on the 4th month? What is the landlord bonus? How does that paid out? What should I look for? What happens if my income changes? How do I know what my new portion is? What if my household size changes? How do I report that and fix my, the subsidy amount if I'm eligible for more? What is how do I communicate with my landlord, my property manager? What do I do if they're not responding to me? I think asking any questions like that to whoever you have available to you, will maybe help you feel, a little more comfortable once you are on day one or day two of your lease. Understanding utilities. Is this in my name? How do I pay this? What about internet? What does that look like? There's so many things, but kind of trying to think, especially if you've never been a leaseholder before. I know with my first apartment, I didn't know I had to turn the electricity on. So I was in the dark for like a weekend, and that was
Oh
not
no.
very, it was kind of scary. And I was like, oh, I guess I should have known this. But, and like you said too, Khadijah, like you wish you had known some of these things in hindsight. So it's hard to think, obviously, down the line always, but just, I think most importantly, really understanding how the vouchers work, the subsidy works, and the breakdown of the money, because that's where, people are going to be looking the closest, the kind of record of the account, and it's your responsibility as a leaseholder. So you want to know what you're being held responsible for.
All right. Thank you so much. So I think the theme of this whole podcast is just um obviously knowing your lease, but also asking questions, because that's the best way to know information. And honestly, things change so often. So it's always good to be up to date to certain information. So it's always good to ask questions and stuff like that. So guys, we are at the end of Hear Our Voices. It's your host again, KZ. And don't forget to go on our Twitter account. The links will be down below. Also go to our Instagram and see our quotes of the week from each podcast coming up before you. Thanks again, and hope to see you, or technically hope you come back to hear us next week. Bye.